Hi guys, welcome to your first video lesson in National 5 Higher RMPS. Each week you'll be asked to watch these videos and to take some notes. You can then screenshot those notes or type them up and send them to me by email through your Glow Group account. Our first unit of study, our chosen world religion, is Buddhism. And we begin today with the life, the death, and the birth of the Buddha. So Siddhartha Gautama, born around the 6th century BCE, as we've already seen, was born in Lumbini, in modern-day southern Nepal, which you can see from the map on your screen there. Siddhartha is a Sanskrit name. And along with Pali, Sanskrit is a language from which we get lots of our technical words that we'll be looking at in our study of Buddhism. Now, you already know some of these Sanskrit and Pali words. For example, you will have used the word karma or kama, and you will have probably used the word nirvana or nibbana. And these words, which are, of course, very important in the Buddhist tradition, are Sanskrit and Pali words. So Siddhartha is a Sanskrit name, and it means one who has accomplished a goal. And Gautama is his family name, like Beggan is my family name. His father, said to be a king, King Suddhodana, was the leader of a very large clan, and the clan was called Shakya, and the Buddha is sometimes referred to as Shakyamuni Buddha. It's not clear from the earliest stories about the Buddha's life whether he was a hereditary king, his father, or more of a sort of tribal or clan chief. It's also possible that he was actually an elected leader within the clan. Either way, Siddhartha grew up as a prince and enjoyed all of the luxuries and opulence that you might have expected from someone growing up in a royal family. Suddhodana, his father, married two sisters who were said to be princesses of another clan from northern India. Those sisters, Maya, Siddhartha's mother, or Mahayana as she's sometimes called, and the other sister was Pajapati Gautama. Siddhartha was Maya's only child, and she died shortly after his birth, as we've seen from the video that we just watched. Pajapati, however, later became the first Buddhist nun, and she raised Siddhartha as her own in the city of Kapilavastu. When Prince Siddhartha was just a few days old, a holy man, a religious man, a seer, prophesied over the prince. Some stories say there were actually as many as 9 holy men who the king called to interpret the meaning of the queen's dreams and to relay stories about the very special significance of his son. And it was foretold by these religious men that the boy would be either a great military conqueror or a great spiritual teacher. Now, King Suddhodana much preferred the idea of his son being a great military leader and ruling after his own death, and so raised him and prepared his son for that kind of role. He raised him in great luxury and, the story goes, shielded his son Siddhartha from all outside influences, from all knowledge of religion, and especially from any kind of human suffering. Siddhartha was married at the tender age of 16 to his cousin Yasodhana, who was also 16. No doubt an arranged marriage, as was very common in those days. Yasodhara was the daughter of a Kolya chief, and Kolya tribe from northern Italy was where Siddhartha's mother came from. But by far the most important story about the life of the Buddha is one called the 4 sights, or the 4 passing sights. And that's the story that we're going to look at now. In Buddhist tradition, it's said that Siddhartha wanted to see what life was like outside of the very opulent and luxurious palaces and the palace grounds in which he grew up. Remember, he lived a very, very sheltered lives. And by the time he reached the age of 29, he had very little experience, if any, of the outside world. He was oblivious to the realities of life that you and I are very familiar with, like sickness and old age and death and other kinds of suffering. So one day, overcome with curiosity, Prince Siddhartha asked his charioteer Channa to take him on a series of journeys into the countryside. And he saw 4 things that ultimately transformed his life forever. So the first thing that Siddhartha saw on his journeys with Channa was an old man. It was at the outskirts of the city that Siddhartha saw this old man who was so feeble that he could not walk properly. He was in a lot of pain. The prince, when he saw him, got down from his carriage and tried to help the man reach shelter. And that's a really important part of the story, because Siddhartha's compassion, his loving kindness, a very, very important part of the Buddhist tradition. It's referred to as metta. So his heart ached for this man that he saw, and he did absolutely everything he could to help him and to relieve his pain. And so confident was he that the help he'd given him would make a difference that he was absolutely convinced the old man would get better, as it were. Then, the second time that he went out with his charioteer Channa, the next day, the prince found that man bitten by disease and old age and worse off than he was before. And this shocked the prince, because none of his efforts to help him had made any kind of difference or brought him any closer to recovery. So for the first time in his life, Siddhartha felt absolutely helpless, felt powerless. When the prince returned the next day, he found that the man was dead. He died, and he was being carried on a stretcher in a funeral procession, taken to burial grounds outside of the village. The man looked pathetic, and his death left an indelible mark on Prince Siddhartha. He spoke with Channa about what he'd seen and discovered that he was not the only one. And that might seem a little bit ridiculous to you and I, to not know that people are sick and get old and die. But remember, the facts of the story are not as important as the symbolism that these events have in Buddhist tradition, and ultimately how they transformed Siddhartha's life and led him on the path to become the Buddha. So he was shocked to hear that other people too grew old and got sick and died all the time. So very troubled by this, he began to think about how he could rule over a people who were going to suffer like this, and he didn't like that idea at all. The stark realities of old age, disease, and death seized him and sickened the prince. Still very much troubled by what he had seen, the prince set out again a 4th time. This time, he decided he wanted to escape all of the worries that these first 3 things had given him. So he went to the park, basically. And there, he saw a wandering ascetic. An ascetic is a monk, a mendicant monk, somebody who has deliberately thrown away all of their possessions, left their home, left their life, and is traveling with the barest essentials to find the truth, to discover, if you like, the truth about life. So he saw this wandering ascetic, a mendicant monk, dressed in saffron-coloured robes, and the look of the monk's very placid footsteps, his very calm countenance, his peaceful demeanour, really struck Prince Siddhartha. He looked absolutely free from any kind of worry or cares of the world. And Siddhartha thought how wonderful, how marvellous it would be if he could have that kind of same worry-free life. The charioteer who had taken him on these journeys, Channa, explained that the ascetic was somebody who'd renounced the world and sought release from fear of death and from suffering that life would bring and brings to us all. For a time, the prince, after seeing these things, returned to palace life, but he took absolutely no pleasure in it. Even the news that his wife Yasodhara had given birth to a son did nothing to lift him out of his misery. The child, by the way, was called Rahula, which means fetter, and a fetter is something like a handcuff or something that binds us and ties us to one place or keeps us in one place. And that's quite significant because later Prince Siddhartha makes a decision to become like this ascetic monk that he saw and to leave his wife and his newborn son. And that idea of his son being something that would keep him back from his journey towards enlightenment is an important one. So one night, the prince wanders the palace alone, and the luxuries that had once been the pleasure of his life, a normal part of his life, all now seem to him as grotesque and ugly and not nearly as worth what they were before. Musicians, dancing girls had all fallen asleep that night and were all sprawled out, snoring and sputtering after a big party. And Prince Siddhartha was reflecting on the old age and the disease and the death that would overtake them all, and eventually turn all of these bodies to dust. He realized then that he could no longer be content living life as a prince in a palace. So the prince decided that the way to freedom, the answer, if you like, to all of his troubles and all of his misery and worry was to pursue the life that the mendicant monk or the ascetic had chosen. He decided then he was going to live like that in search of the truth. If he didn't have any belongings, then he might not have any pain or any suffering. He could be free from all of the things that would cause all of this pain and suffering in life. So Siddhartha decided to give up his life of luxury and privilege and seek answers. He cut his hair, he wore similar robes like the monk, and he walked away from the palace, from his life of luxury, from his royal duties, and even from his wife and from his son. That very night he left the palace and his hometown, shaved his head at the river Anoma, so the story goes, and changed from his royal clothes into a beggar's robe, renounced all of the luxury that he'd known, and he began his quest for what we'll talk much more in depth about later, this idea of enlightenment. Riding his horse, or Prince Siddhartha's horse, which was called Kanthaka, Chana, his charioteer, returned all of Siddhartha's belongings that he'd gotten rid of, including his cut hair and his weapons that he'd taken with him, returned them all to his palace and to his father. Following the departure of Siddhartha, Kanthaka, his horse, so the story goes, died of a broken heart, but was reborn as a Brahmin and went on to attend Dharma talks, teaching talks by Gautama Buddha later on, which is an interesting legend and story. So that eventually even the former horse of the Buddha achieved enlightenment, which is a curious little tale. These life-changing sights, these four things that Siddhartha saw, would become later known in Buddhism as the four passing sights. So next week we'll look at these four passing sights in a little bit more depth and their special significance for Buddhists. And we'll also continue our story of the Buddha and his journey towards enlightenment. Thanks for watching, guys. Don't forget, jot down as many notes as you can. Try to use your own words where you can, and then screenshot those or type them up and send them to me. Look forward to seeing you, at least by video, again next week. Take care.